So, you decided to try smoking. Oh hi! You caught me being real with today's youth. Speaking of being real, let's talk about the realistic artwork of Bryan Hitch. Hello! Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. When it comes to reading comics, the stuff that I like best is artwork that's very realistic and highly detailed. But ultimately, there's a fine line between artwork that's well rendered, well executed, highly detailed, and having that balance of good storytelling. Ultimately, you want a book that's easy to comprehend and read panel to panel as compared to just being cool image after cool image. Now, an artist that I think strikes that balance is Bryan Hitch. He's an interesting artist to analyze because for the first half, roughly, of his career, he was a solid workman. Then he made some adjustments to his technique, his style, and all of a sudden he was putting out books like The Authority and The Ultimates, and his popularity exploded. His artwork in stuff like The Ultimates ultimately influenced the design of the characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and a lot of Bryan Hitch's artwork was picked up by Hollywood. He created artwork for Doctor Who, he created designs for the Star Trek films. So let's break down his artwork, his history, and see what makes him so special. Born in England in 1970, Hitch grew up reading and loving comics. He sent in a submission to Marvel UK and got his first professional assignment at only 17 years old. His early work was for Marvel UK, which was an imprint created to handle American reprints in England, as well as some unique stories in a universe that shared the characters from Marvel's main comics, but was in its own independent universe. His first work was in 1987 on Action Force, which was a unique continuity of stories based on the G.I. Joe characters from here in America. His early work wore his influences on its sleeve. He was clearly inspired by the work of Alan Davis, a popular British artist who at the time had worked on British titles like 2000 AD and Captain Britain alongside writer Alan Moore. Davis was working on Batman when Hitch broke in, and you can see some similarities to the way he creates shading along faces and musculature. It's smooth, flowing, and tends to use multiple light sources to highlight shapes. Even today, when Hitch's artwork has evolved, he still shades in a similar fashion. Hitch continued to work for Marvel UK on titles like Transformers and Death's Head, both with writer Simon Furman. The Transformers comic was published weekly with reprints of the US comics, and Hitch contributed to stories that filled in the gaps in between. Death's Head was a robotic bounty hunter, or as he calls himself, a freelance peacekeeping agent, that Furman created with artist Jeff Sr. as a new adversary for the Transformers. He went on to appear in Marvel's Doctor Who comic, and Hitch began illustrating him in 1988 for the first issue of Death's Head's solo series. After 10 issues illustrating Death's Head, Marvel in New York City took notice of Bryan Hitch and hired him to be the illustrator on a title of theirs called Sensational She-Hulk. Artist and writer John Byrne had rebooted She-Hulk to be more of a comedy book, but after just 8 issues, he left the title due to creative differences with Marvel. Shocker. So at that point, Bryan Hitch took over as the artist, and he kept it alive for, he worked on it for about a year or so, but sales-wise, it floundered, and it didn't ultimately get him noticed at that point in time. Hitch spent the first half of the 90s working on fill-in issues and various Marvel UK titles. He got in front of a slightly larger audience in the latter half of the 90s, working on books for Valiant and eventually Image, specifically Jim Lee's Wildstorm imprint. More specifically, he began working with Warren Ellis on a book called Stormwatch. Ellis and Hitch had not created the series, but worked on stories of the superhero team that was overseen by the United Nations to protect the world, until there was a one-shot comic by Ellis that had the xenomorphs from the Alien films kill off most of the characters Ellis had not created. This was immediately followed by Bryan Hitch teaming with Warren Ellis for a new book called The Authority that featured the surviving members of Stormwatch deciding to independently and proactively hunt down supervillains and cosmic threats to Earth. The book ran for 12 issues from May of 1999 through April of 2000, and it was what got Hitch noticed. In Hitch's first work on Stormwatch, you can see similar shading and facial techniques to Alan Davis's work: squinting eyes, clenched jaws, flowing line work. Throughout Stormwatch, and especially on The Authority, Hitch adjusted his line art to have slightly harsher angles and radically detailed backgrounds. He has said that he considers himself a storyteller first and works as an illustrator only to tell those stories. He said that he does not enjoy drawing vehicles or buildings, but does enjoy the story that he can tell by using such elements. And The Authority features action on an epic scale, which required massive cityscapes, spaceships, and cars. He began using more and more panels that stretched across the page, which came to be called widescreen action. The script by Ellis and artwork by Hitch attempted to tell superhero stories in more cinematic terms, using a similar aspect ratio in panels as you might see on a movie screen, and building action sequences that would only be able to be accomplished in movies with astronomical budgets. I had been exposed to Bryan Hitch's artwork when I read Death's Head and She-Hulk when I was younger, but I didn't exactly take notice of who he was. But when The Authority came out, I noticed him in a big way, and he fascinated me. I really liked his artwork, and in fact, down the road, I went on to purchase a piece of original artwork by Bryan Hitch from The Authority, where the Midnighter is facing down villain Kaizen Gamora. That said, I've talked a lot about his storytelling techniques and his style, but what I really would like to dig into now is his approach to character design, which was highly influential for some movies that followed. On Stormwatch, two of the main characters were Apollo and Midnighter, which were riffs on Superman and Batman, but also a bit more ruthless and in love with one another. While Hitch still illustrated Apollo with a tight spandex uniform, he also made sure to show lighting effects on it that indicated it was a material other than ordinary spandex. And with Midnighter, he was careful to add cloth folds, leather creases, and lighting effects and seams. Illustrating seams on superhero uniforms can actually be quite overdone these days, and if it's not done well, it's actually distracting. But when Bryan Hitch started doing it, it was fairly revolutionary, and it was really his specific technique of adding things like seams and ribbing that made for verisimilitude. It made costumes look more real, and it was that epic action and the verisimilitude of his character design that made Marvel take notice, and they decided they wanted him to work on a book called The Ultimates. That was going to be a rebooted version of the Avengers in something Marvel launched in 2000 called their Ultimate Comics line. It was an attempt to start over popular characters like X-Men and Spider-Man in the modern day without any of their previous continuity, so that new readers could come in and enjoy. With that said, the original idea that writer Mark Millar and artist Bryan Hitch came up with was going to focus on huge fantasy elements from Thor that the entire team, known as the Ultimates, would face. While that was being developed, 9/11 took place, and it reshaped their plan. The creators decided that their comic book would take place in recognizable cities and deal with the idea of super terrorism. Hitch knew that he would be drawing more real-world elements and decided to reflect that in his character designs. Originally, he was going to essentially do similar versions of Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, and so on. But now, he decided to redesign the characters. There would be visible seams, ribbing, and recognizable leather and neoprene textures. Many of these designs would go on to influence Marvel's films that they began making about 5 years later. For instance, Nick Fury originally appeared in the Ultimate Comics with close cropped hair and fancy suits. Hitch explicitly modeled Fury on the appearance of actor Samuel Jackson, shaved his head, gave him a black trench coat, and added scarring around his missing eye. That's exactly how he appeared in the movies, starting with 2008's Iron Man. Not every design he created was adapted for film. For instance, Iron Man was based off of Ari Granov's designs, and Thor appeared more or less as he had since Jack Kirby's first issues, along with the beard that Walt Simonson gave him. But Captain America was very influenced by Hitch's new designs. Instead of a molded cowl, Hitch designed Captain America with a helmet and a uniform that had more military inspiration, like normal combat boots and gloves. Hawkeye's redesign incorporated a look based off of sports gear and sunglasses, ditching his unique mask and swashbuckling boots. Hitch has said that he looks at military uniforms, sports gear, and even spacesuits for inspiration in tackling superhero suit design aimed at being set in the real world. It's now much more common to see seams in superhero uniforms, and when it's just lines across form-fitting clothes, it can be a bit much. But prior to Hitch's approach, few artists even attempted to show zippers, seams, and other real-world aspects of the uniform. The trick is not over-designing a uniform because, of course, as an artist, you have to be able to repeat that design again and again throughout a title. And I think Hitch's artwork strikes that balance. When you look at his artwork, it may be more detailed than previous costumes that we've seen, but it's a far cry from all the realistic detail that you actually see in the movies. But the movies themselves, I think all of the Avengers, took at least some inspiration from the artwork that Bryan Hitch did throughout the Ultimates Volume 1 and 2. When you break down Hitch's approach these days, you see some commonalities. There's absolutely the detail, which has led to some delays on his work. For instance, he only did 6 of the 10 issues of Age of Ultron, and both volumes of the Ultimates had some delays. But I'd argue the end result is worth it. That detail is seen in the other aspects of Hitch's work. For instance, his establishing shots and widescreen action. Both of those probably made people in Hollywood take notice of his artwork, but it also helps the reader to see a recognizable location and understand the impact of action taking place there when the devastation from a battle occurs. Similarly, his so-called widescreen action mimics the aspect ratio of film, but Hitch still manages to utilize the fact that he works on comics in ways TV and film can't duplicate. His scenes can often have a deep focus, and the artwork itself is often careful to have a composition that lends itself to moving the eye across and around the panel that it all occurs in. He took his widescreen action to its highest reaches in an issue of Volume 2 of the Ultimates with a fold-out 8-page long spread. Essentially one massive panel, the spread features each of the Ultimates engaged with an army of Asgardian enemies, with the action flowing left to right and moving from the middle to foreground and back. Hitch's action scenes and establishing shots are hyper-detailed, and an instance where he uses real-world reference. It isn't always copied, but he clearly models certain shots of cities, vehicles, and hardware off of real-world photos that he lightboxes to get just right. At the same time, he is not so beholden to his reference that it extends to his characters. Those he may look at for reference for getting clothing details correctly, but he imagines them in his head and moves the placement and focus to get the most emotion out of a panel. There's a sense of weight and motion to his characters that you can lose when you're just tracing a photograph. The final aspect that Hitch's current work focuses on is close-up portraits of his characters. As an artist, the face and the hands are the most expressive elements available to relay emotion to a reader. You can express the tension in hard lines and taut musculature, for example. And Hitch will often pull in close so that you truly feel that expression. He isn't keeping his characters small or at arm's length from the reader. They're right there in your face. One of the things that I really appreciate about Bryan Hitch is his patience as an artist. So, of course, it's going to take a lot of time to do a detailed city establishing shot. But beyond that, I think he really shows that he takes time by doing multiple drafts of roughs, figuring out things like character placement and composition. It's very important to him that each panel is clear and tells a story. It's important that you can read the dialogue from left to right. It's important that you're drawn into the panel by having an interesting angle, some sort of way to engage you in the action. Hitch also uses a variety of penciling and inking techniques. Some artists will primarily use only one or two pencils, like a technical pencil or maybe a drafting pencil. While Hitch uses technical pencils for detail, he clearly uses traditional pencils as well to shade areas or to use side strokes for texture. And when he inks, he's not afraid to use some heavy blacks instead of texturing everything with crosshatching. His feathering is possibly his most identifiable stylistic quirk. It's gorgeous. After the Ultimates, Bryan Hitch was employed by Marvel on some of their biggest projects, like their Fantastic Four title, a limited series called Captain America Reborn, and 6 out of the 10 issues of the Age of Ultron story. He also did some creator-owned work with America's Got Powers and Real Heroes. Starting around 2015, he transitioned to writing more, and he stayed busy with DC, working on titles like Justice League of America. Following the huge success of The Ultimates and its very cinematic approach, Hitch was hired by the BBC in 2005 to design a new TARDIS set for Doctor Who. In 2009, director J.J. Abrams had Hitch design a spaceship, the ship that Spock piloted in the Star Trek reboot movie. As a reader, looking at Bryan Hitch's artwork is exciting and engaging, but studying him as an artist is an interesting case study. He has a very careful, deliberate approach. He takes his time doing a lot of different roughs to find just the perfect angle, the composition, the storytelling needs, and the emotion necessary for each panel. He's very patient. A lot of artists would lose their patience just having to illustrate a lot of perspective grids, but that's something that Bryan Hitch is willing to take his time and get right. There's a book that he released called Bryan Hitch's Ultimate Comics Studio. And it doesn't exactly teach you how to be an artist, but it does go over in fine detail his specific techniques. Everything that I've talked about stylistically, as well as the tools he'll use, the types of pencils, the inking brushes and pens that he uses, his Photoshop setup, all of that, as well as things like coloring and revising. So this is an interesting book to study if you want to study Bryan Hitch specifically. So I sort of give that a recommend. I don't recommend it as a book to learn how to draw, but if you're already an artist and you want to learn more about Bryan Hitch, this is very interesting. I would also recommend getting an issue of Death's Head from very early in his career, and then any issue of The Ultimates, and really comparing it, finding what he still does the same and where he decided to adjust his technique. There is a lot that you can learn from there. Anyway, speaking of great art, let's take a look at what kind of fan art came in this week. Tyler Garcia returns with 2 pieces, a cover featuring me stealing Spider-Man's dance moves, and one where I catch superheroes in gachapon capsules. Wiley Parkhurst created the impossible Mr. Bat Mixia's Mite Pitalik man, and he has a Comic Tropes comic and doll. Yulia Kay illustrated a very flattering portrait, and you can see more of her great artwork at her Instagram page. Tony wins the internet with this fantastic pun, Batman the Killing Trope. You can see more of his work on his Instagram account. Muhammad drew a fantastic Age of Infotron cover based off of Iron Man's iconic first appearance. You can see more of Muhammad's work on YouTube and Pinterest. Grimlock illustrated me going Super Saiyan, and he also sent in me as All Might from My Hero Academia. Seems like someone likes manga and anime. Artist These Deadly Rays created a piece named El Troponaut, which I love. Check out more of his work on Instagram. The new Hellboy movie inspired Darby Power to envision myself as Hellboy with Infotron as the titular corpse. Very clever. This is me as Osamu Tezuka's famous Astro Boy, as envisioned by artist Victor Karanja. Donald Mai sent in a gorgeous sketch of myself in front of the Comic Tropes set. You can see more of Donald's work on his Instagram. I love this cartoon sent in by Mark Wilburn, which harkens back to the episode I was flying on a lawn chair attached to 17 seagulls. Bruno Aste created the piece that you see in MS Paint, which shows a patience that rivals that of Bryan Hitch. Finally, artist John Ross has me getting arrested by Judge Dredd for jaywalking, which is probably the crime I would be most likely to get arrested for. Thank you everyone for sending in such amazing fan art this week. It means a lot to me. By the way, the channel just crossed 50,000 subscribers, so thank you to all of you out there for making that possible. If you would like to have your artwork featured on the channel, as long as it has something to do directly with comic tropes, just send it to comictropes@gmail.com. I'm happy to feature it. And I will then enter everybody that entered in a chance to win a Gachapon prize that I picked up in Japan, and it comes out of the Gacha Pony machine that was donated to us by Lunar Shine Store. So I've got a bag here with a bunch of numbers. I've got, let's see, 13 people this week. Let me grab all the numbers. So each one corresponds to an artist, and I'm just going to drop them in the bag, shuffle it up. Let's see who wins. It is number 4. Number 4 is Tony. Tony, let's see what you won. All right, come on. Here we go. All right, I've got a little Gachapon inside of a bigger Gachapon capsule. Trying to pull it out here. Oh, very cool. It's some sort of like a muscle figure. If you remember those from like the 80s, it's like a pink monster, pink rubber monster. I don't know if he's a wrestler or an alien. I definitely remember picking this up. Good news, I am going back to Japan at the end of this year, so I'm going to be picking up some more Gachapons then. I may take a small break, because honestly, it takes me forever to get these mailed out. I know I'm really late on mailing some of those out for some of you out there. But I do appreciate that you're willing to send in your artwork, that you're willing to subscribe, and a lot of you have helped support me through both Patreon and Ko-fi. Patreon, you can do a monthly contribution as low as $1 a month, and Ko-fi is if you just want to do a single one-time tip. So I sincerely appreciate that kind of support. I would love to get to the point where I could do this channel full time. I've got a lot of ideas for additional content, but I am definitely like right at my limit. I have a full-time job, and then this honestly is almost as much time as a full-time job. It's at least a part-time job. So it definitely takes a lot of time. Bryan Hitch, an artist that I love. Thank you so much for letting me talk about why I like his artwork and why he's interesting to study. I really think he is a stealth creator for the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. You know, he didn't write it, but the designs for all of the superheroes are clearly influenced by his approach. So I think it's pretty cool to see that kind of influence. Imagine being an artist and having that kind of an influence where just millions and millions of people are seeing things that you helped create. That's got to be a good feeling, I hope. Oh, you know what? That makes me think of something. A lot of times, top-level creators like this are definitely paid really awesome page rates. But one thing that working as an artist at places like Marvel and DC does not seem to give you is, you know, a health plan or retirement plan, basically. And there's a creator, Bill Mantlo. I've discussed him on this channel many times before, and I even did an episode about his character's Cloak and Dagger. He also created Rocket Raccoon, who obviously we're about to see in the new Avengers movie. We love Rocket. We love a lot of the characters that Bill Mantlo created. But unfortunately, Bill was involved in a hit-and-run accident, and he has permanent disabilities, severe ones. His older brother, Michael, takes care of him, but it's not easy. It's not easy, and unfortunately, they have had to reach out through GoFundMe to ask for some help. But it seems like the campaign is going well. I contributed to it, and I shared it on Twitter, but this reaches more people. You know, it's too bad, in a way, that we, the fans, have to sometimes feel responsible for taking care of the creators that we love. That shouldn't really be our responsibility. But the sad truth is some creators out there are on hard times. And if you've ever enjoyed their artwork, it's probably worth at least considering what you might be able to donate to the cause, because when we all work together as one big community, you know, it's the idea of many hands make light work. A small contribution from a lot of people can mean a lot to just one individual. So if you are in a position to help, I'll have a link in the video's description, and it's just something worth considering. Bill Mantlo gave us a lot of cool characters. He did some great work on titles like ROM, Space Knight, Micronauts, all sorts of really cool stuff. So just something worth considering. But thank you so much for watching this through to the end. If you've made it here, you're a real fan. I appreciate you. I'm going to see you next week. We've been doing a lot of artists, so I think it's time for a writer next week. Yeah, I've got a lot of cool ideas coming up. We're going to see some more indie stuff too, so get ready for that. Until then, keep reading comics.